For centuries, the galaxy had been ruled by the Zorathians, a powerful alien species. Their empire stretched across countless star systems, with no one daring to challenge their authority. The Zorathians were feared and respected, known for their unmatched technology and ruthless control. Any planet that resisted their rule was quickly brought to its knees. No rebellion had ever lasted longer than a few months. The aliens had a reputation of being invincible, and their empire seemed unshakable. Those who tried to oppose them were crushed without mercy. Peace had settled over the galaxy, but it was a peace forged through fear and domination. On the edge of this empire, at the farthest reaches of their control, something strange happened. A small human warship appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. The Zorathians were used to seeing ships from various races pass through their borders, but this ship was different. It was far smaller than anything they had ever seen, and its technology was unlike anything they had encountered. It was old, battered, and clearly built for war, but there was something about it that made the Zorathians uneasy. The warship didn't respond to the usual requests for identification. It didn't fire any warning shots or make any threatening moves. It simply crossed into their space and continued on its course, as if it belonged there. This was something the Zorathians had never faced before, an enemy that refused to acknowledge their dominance. They couldn't understand why this human ship would be so bold. Did the humans not know who they were dealing with, or were they simply too arrogant to care? The alien fleet stationed at the border immediately took notice. They prepared to intercept the intruder, ready to teach this human ship a lesson. But even as they readied their weapons, they were uncertain. The humans had always been known for their unpredictable nature. The Zorathians had heard stories about how humans had once defeated other species much stronger than themselves. They had a reputation for survival against all odds, but this was different. The Zorathians had never allowed anyone to enter their space without consequences. The human warship continued its journey deeper into Zorathian territory, moving slowly but steadily. Its captain, a woman named Sarah Carter, sat at the helm, staring out at the stars ahead. She wasn't worried. She knew the risk, but she had her orders. The mission was simple: go into Zorathian space and send a message. It wasn't supposed to be a full-scale invasion, just a demonstration of what humanity was capable of. Sarah had trained for years for this moment, and she had faith in her crew and their ship. They may have been outgunned, but they were not outmatched. The humans had always been resourceful, and if there was one thing they could do, it was survive. As they crossed deeper into enemy territory, the crew remained calm, focused on their tasks. They knew the Zorathians were watching them. They knew the consequences of their actions, but they had no intention of backing down. They had come too far to turn back now. Sarah's mind raced as she thought about the decision she had made to enter Zorathian space. The higher-ups in her government had made it clear that humanity needed to assert itself on the galactic stage, but she didn't know how the aliens would respond. The Zorathians had never dealt with humans like this before. Back on the Zorathian flagship, Commander Vrax watched as the human ship grew closer on his screen. He was puzzled. There was no distress signal, no attempt to communicate. The humans had always been unpredictable, but this was something new. He had never seen a species so bold. Normally, when a ship entered Zorathian space without permission, it would be destroyed without hesitation. But this time, something felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that the humans weren't just trespassing. They were sending a message. Vrax turned to his officers. "Prepare the fleet. We will show them the cost of defying the Zorathian Empire." His voice was steady, but his mind was uncertain. The human ship was too small to pose a real threat, but the way it moved, so confidently, made him wary. Perhaps it was a trap. He had to be cautious. As the warship continued its course, Sarah remained resolute. She could feel the tension rising among her crew, but she knew they had a job to do. Their mission wasn't just about showing strength. It was about sending a message to the galaxy that humanity would not be intimidated. They were no longer the weak, insignificant species that had once been overlooked. They were here to stay, and they would fight for their place in the stars. The silence in the warship's control room was deafening as they neared the border of Zorathian space. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. Either the Zorathians would fire, or they would back off. Sarah's eyes flicked to the radar, watching the blips on the screen that marked the approaching alien fleet. She braced herself for what was to come. The tension was unbearable. The ship's engines hummed steadily, a reminder that they were moving forward, regardless of what lay ahead. And as the warship crossed the final threshold into the heart of Zorathian space, the question hung in the air. Would the Zorathians crush them like they had crushed so many before, or would they recognize the humans as something different, a new force in the galaxy, unwilling to be ignored? Sarah's grip tightened on the controls, but she remained calm. Whatever came next, they would face it head-on. The galaxy would soon know the answer. The Zorathians didn't wait long to act. The moment the human warship crossed the line into their space, their defenses went on high alert. Commander Vrax, aboard the flagship, quickly issued orders for the fleet to mobilize. They had to be certain of the threat before they acted, but the humans' actions were too bold to ignore. The ship's course made it clear. They weren't turning back. It was only a matter of time before the Zorathians would have to confront them. As the human warship drifted closer, Sarah Carter remained steady at the helm. Her crew, though anxious, trusted her leadership. The ship was armed, but they hadn't come here to start a war, at least not yet. Her orders were clear. They needed to send a message to the Zorathians, to show them that humanity was no longer afraid of their power. This was their first step into the galactic stage, and they had to make it count. The plan had been to approach cautiously, keep their distance, and avoid direct confrontation. But as they neared the alien ships, Sarah felt a growing sense of tension. She could feel the eyes of the galaxy upon them, even though no one else had yet to take notice. "Captain, we have incoming ships," reported Lieutenant Reed, his voice tense. Sarah glanced at the radar. Several Zorathian ships had appeared, surrounding the area. They were massive, towering structures that dwarfed the human warship. The Zorathian fleet was a show of strength. Their weapons pointed directly at the humans. But it wasn't just the size of their ships that made them dangerous. It was their reputation. The Zorathians were notorious for wiping out entire species with little hesitation. The fact that they hadn't immediately attacked meant they were considering their next move. The question was why. Were they unsure of how to deal with this small, seemingly insignificant human ship? Or were they testing to see if humanity would back down? "Prepare for communication," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "They'll want to speak first." Reed nodded and began setting up the channel for a message. Moments later, a Zorathian voice crackled through the speakers, booming and cold. "Human vessel, you are trespassing in Zorathian space. Identify yourselves immediately, or we will take action." Sarah sat up straighter, her mind racing. The Zorathians' tone was stern, but it was clear they were not attacking yet. She had expected a more immediate response, but this was different. It was as if they were still unsure how to handle the situation. "This is Captain Sarah Carter of the human warship Intrepid. We're here to send a message," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "We come in peace, but we won't be intimidated. We claim our place in the galaxy, and we will not bow to anyone." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long before the Zorathian voice returned, colder than before. "Your message has been received. You are warned. Return to your space, or you will face the consequences." Sarah didn't hesitate. "We're not leaving. You can try to stop us, but we're staying." She ended the transmission before they could respond. Her words hung in the air, a challenge thrown at the heart of the Zorathian Empire. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The crew of the Intrepid was in enemy territory, and they were prepared to stand their ground. No one on board knew what would come next, but they had made their point. They had crossed into Zorathian space, and they weren't leaving without a fight. The Zorathians, on the other hand, were divided. Commander Vrax paced the command center of his flagship, his mind working furiously. His fleet outnumbered the human vessel by a vast margin, and he had already given the order for a blockade. The humans would have no way to escape. He had expected them to turn back when confronted, but they hadn't. His officers were growing impatient, their hands resting on the weapons control panels, eager for a reason to strike. "Commander, we could destroy them easily," one of the officers suggested, his voice cold and clinical. Vrax turned sharply to him, his eyes narrowing. "We could," he agreed, "but that would be a mistake. This is no ordinary enemy. There's something different about them." His tone was reluctant, almost hesitant. He had fought against countless species, but humans were different. They had a reputation for surviving against impossible odds. And while this small warship was no match for the Zorethian fleet, the humans had made it clear they weren't afraid. It was this defiance that worried him. "No, we'll watch them for now. Let's see what they do next." The human warship, meanwhile, had started to move again. Sarah Carter's orders were clear: continue onward. They needed to push the message further. The Intrepid moved steadily toward the center of Zorethian space, its small size and unconventional tactics giving it an advantage. The Zorethians would expect the human ship to turn and retreat, but that wasn't going to happen. Sarah's mind raced with strategies. The longer they held their position, the more pressure they would put on the Zorethians. Reed looked at the captain, concern flashing across his face. "Captain, are you sure about this? We're outnumbered." Sarah glanced at him, her expression unwavering. "I'm sure. We're sending a message. We don't back down. Not anymore." The alien ships hovered ominously in the distance, watching. The human warship, though vastly outclassed in terms of firepower, held its ground. It was a simple act of defiance, a signal to the galaxy that humans would not be intimidated. It was only the beginning, but in that moment, the first seeds of doubt were planted in the Zorethian mind. For the first time in centuries, their rule was being questioned, and that was something they weren't ready for. The Zorethians might have ruled without challenge for eons, but the humans had come, and they were here to stay. The Zorethians had always seen themselves as untouchable, and their arrogance had served them well for millennia. Their empire was vast and unchallenged, but now, for the first time in their history, they were facing something entirely new, a race that refused to bow. The human warship Intrepid had pushed into the heart of Zorethian space, and Commander Vrax was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be a simple situation to resolve. His fleet surrounded the human vessel, but the humans weren't backing down. Captain Sarah Carter stood in the command center of her ship, staring at the displays that showed the surrounding Zorethian fleet. There were far too many ships to count, each one bristling with weapons. She had expected this. She had known the Zorethians wouldn't let her go so easily. But there was something else she hadn't anticipated: the complete lack of fear from her crew. They weren't panicking. They weren't running for cover. They were ready for whatever came next. The crew had trained for years for this moment. They had been prepared to fight, to survive, and to hold their ground in the face of overwhelming odds. Sarah's voice echoed through the ship's intercom, steady and calm. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're going to show them what humanity is capable of." Lieutenant Reed, the ship's second-in-command, turned to her with a concerned look. "Captain, the Zorethians could destroy us in seconds. What's our plan?" Sarah took a deep breath. "We may be small, but we're not outmatched. We're going to use our speed and unpredictability to our advantage. Trust the crew." Reed nodded, though he was still unsure. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but the humans had one thing the Zorethians didn't: resourcefulness. While the Zorethians relied on brute force and overwhelming firepower, humanity had always survived by adapting, by using whatever they had in unexpected ways. Sarah had no doubt they would find a way to make it work. "Captain," another officer spoke up, "the Zorethians are closing in. They're preparing to engage." The ship's sensors confirmed the threat. Several massive Zorethian ships were moving into position, their weapons charging up, Sarah's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. They had no chance of winning a full-scale battle. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to. If they could evade long enough and keep the Zorathians occupied, they might be able to force a stalemate. Evasive maneuvers, now, Sarah ordered. The Intrepid lurched as its engines fired up, dodging to the side just as a Zorathian blast narrowly missed. The human ship was small, agile, and fast. The Zorathians weren't used to such unpredictability. They were used to facing enemies who would either surrender or break under pressure. But these humans were different. They weren't retreating. They weren't giving up. They were making it clear that they would fight until their last breath. The Zorathians fired again, and the Intrepid swerved, narrowly avoiding the blasts. A few of the human crew members gasped in awe, their hearts racing as they felt the intensity of the Zorathian fire. The Zorathians were fast, but the Intrepid was quicker. The human ship danced around the alien fire like a shadow, barely skimming the edges of danger, each move calculated and precise. "That's it," Reed exclaimed. "We've got them on the run. Keep it up, Captain." Sarah's hands flew across the control panels, guiding the ship with expertise. The Zorathians, for all their power, were struggling to match the Intrepid's speed. They fired blast after blast, but the human ship was always one step ahead. The Zorathians weren't used to fighting like this, and they weren't prepared for the kind of tactics that the humans were employing. As the battle raged on, Sarah realized something important. The Zorathians, despite their overwhelming strength, were not prepared for the chaos that the humans brought. They had grown comfortable in their power, accustomed to an enemy who would fight fair, who would follow the rules of battle. But the humans didn't play by those rules. They fought to win, using everything at their disposal, no matter how unorthodox or unexpected. Vrax watched the scene unfold on his command screen, growing more and more frustrated. His fleet was large, but it wasn't fast. The human ship was wearing them down, using hit-and-run tactics, forcing the Zorathians to waste their firepower on an elusive target. His ships were powerful, yes, but they were not designed for this kind of combat. The humans were showing no signs of fear, and that was what truly worried him. "Commander," one of his officers said, "we're losing time. Should we engage them directly? They're wearing us thin." Vrax clenched his fists. The human ship was annoying, yes, but it was also showing them something important. The Zorathians were not invincible. For the first time in his career, Vrax felt uncertainty. He had been taught that the Zorathians' might was unmatched, that their strength alone was enough to keep the galaxy under their thumb. But now, for the first time, he had doubts. What if this human ship was only the beginning? What if humanity was more than just a nuisance? "Hold position," Vrax ordered. "Let's see how far they're willing to push." The Intrepid continued to dodge and weave through the Zorathian fleet, the crew aboard watching with bated breath. The constant roar of the ship's engines filled the air as it danced through enemy fire, narrowly avoiding disaster at every turn. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her focus. Her crew was relying on her, and she wasn't going to let them down. "Just a little longer," she murmured to herself. "Just a little longer." It was a battle of patience now, a test of who would break first. The Zorathians had the power, but the humans had the will. They were showing the galaxy that they wouldn't be intimidated. They were fighting back, and the Zorathians weren't sure how to respond. The balance of power in the galaxy was about to shift, and the humans had just begun to make their mark. The Intrepid continued its evasive maneuvers, outsmarting the Zorathians at every turn. The first step had been taken, and for the first time in a long time, the Zorathians began to wonder if the balance of power in the galaxy was about to change. The human warship Intrepid had now been inside Zorathian space for hours, its small size and unpredictable maneuvers forcing the larger Zorathian fleet into an unusual position. They couldn't destroy it outright, not yet. The Zorathians had never faced such a challenge before, and the human ship's agility was starting to irritate them. Commander Vrax knew they were wasting time, but he couldn't act hastily. If he ordered an all-out attack and destroyed the ship too quickly, it might send the wrong message. But if he let it continue to evade them, it might be seen as a sign of weakness. Back on the Intrepid, Sarah Carter could feel the tension in the air. Her crew was exhausted, but they were holding on. She had never expected to engage the Zorethians for this long, but they were managing to stay one step ahead. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the ship's course once again, narrowly avoiding another volley of Zorethian blasts. "We can't keep this up forever," Lieutenant Reed warned, his eyes glued to the control panel. "We're running low on fuel, and we got limited firepower. We might have to make a move soon." Sarah knew he was right. As much as she wanted to keep pressing the Zorethians, they had to make their next move carefully. They couldn't afford to be reckless now. The longer they stayed in Zorethian space, the more they were pushing their luck. "Just a little longer," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We've shown them we won't back down. Now we need to make them listen." Reed nodded, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. The Zorethians hadn't fired a fatal blow yet, but every minute they spent in their territory increased the risk. The tension in the control room was palpable. At that moment, something unexpected happened. A sudden burst of static filled the ship's comm system, followed by a calm, almost eerily smooth voice. "Human ship Intrepid, this is Commander Vrax of the Zorethian Empire. We have been patient with you, but our patience is running thin. You have shown us that you are not like other species, but you will not last much longer. You will either leave our space immediately or face the full wrath of the Zorethian fleet." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the ultimatum. There would be no more room for negotiation. She knew the Zorethians wouldn't hesitate to destroy them if they refused to leave. And yet, in the back of her mind, something told her that this was her chance. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Her voice was calm, but it carried a strength that was undeniable. "Commander Vrax, we're not leaving. You may outnumber us, but we're not here to surrender. We've come to show you that humanity is not afraid of you. We'll fight for our place in the galaxy." There was a pause, and then Vrax's voice came back, almost in disbelief. "You would sacrifice yourselves for nothing. For what purpose, human?" Sarah's eyes flicked to the crew, her heart pounding. She had a choice. She could keep running, buying more time, or she could make a stand. But she had already made up her mind. "We're not fighting for nothing," she replied. "We're fighting for our future. And we won't back down until we have a seat at the table." The words hung in the air, the weight of her declaration settling over the ship. There was no turning back now. Sarah's decision had been made. "We'll see about that," came the cold reply from Vrax. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of weapons charging. The Zorethian fleet was closing in, their guns locked onto the human warship. This was it. The final confrontation was imminent. Sarah quickly gave the order for evasive maneuvers, and the Intrepid jerked forward, once again dodging a blast from the Zorethian fleet. But this time, they weren't going to outrun them. The Zorethians had their sights set on the small human ship, and they weren't going to let it slip away. "We need to act now," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Get us into position for a counterattack. We've got one shot at this." The crew quickly scrambled into action, knowing this was their moment. The Intrepid wasn't designed for long battles. It was built for hit-and-run tactics. But they had the element of surprise on their side. Sarah's plan was simple. They would use their smaller size to sneak behind one of the Zorethian ships, strike at its vulnerable point, and then quickly escape before the rest of the fleet could respond. Lieutenant Reed worked quickly, adjusting the ship's trajectory. "We're in position, Captain. Now what?" Sarah took a deep breath, focusing. The Zorethian fleet was closing in fast, but if they could make it behind one of the larger ships, they could fire a shot that would cripple them. "We're going for the flagship. It's the command ship. If we can disable it, We'll throw their entire fleet into chaos." The Intrepid accelerated, darting toward the massive Zorathian flagship. The fleet around them didn't seem to notice at first, too focused on locking their weapons onto the smaller human ship. But Sarah had timed this perfectly. As the Intrepid slipped behind the flagship, her crew worked in unison to target its engines. "Now," Sarah ordered. Reed pushed the button that sent a powerful shot into the flagship's engines. There was a brilliant flash, and the flagship shuddered as its propulsion systems faltered. The damage was enough to send shockwaves through the Zorathian fleet. For the first time, the Zorathians were thrown into disarray. Their largest ship was crippled, and their carefully coordinated attack was suddenly fractured. "We did it," Reed shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. But Sarah's expression remained tense. They had taken out the flagship, but they weren't out of danger yet. The rest of the Zorathian fleet would be furious, and they wouldn't hesitate to destroy the Intrepid now. The human warship had just delivered a powerful blow, but at what cost? The next few moments would decide their fate. Would they escape, or would this reckless act lead to their destruction? "Get us out of here now," Sarah commanded. The Intrepid shot away from the wreckage of the Zorathian flagship, weaving through the remaining ships, barely evading their fire. But the damage had been done. The Zorathians were rattled, and the Intrepid had proven that humanity could fight back. As the human ship sped away, Sarah knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Humanity had sent its message, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Zorathian fleet was in chaos. The Intrepid's bold strike had rattled their command structure, and the crippled flagship was a symbol of their unexpected vulnerability. Commander Vrax stood in the command center of his ship, his mind racing. The human vessel had just dealt a devastating blow, and the ripple effect was immediate. His officers, once confident, were now questioning their tactics. Vrax clenched his fists. He had never considered that a single human warship would be able to cause such disruption. They were supposed to be a minor nuisance, an easy target for the might of the Zorathian Empire. But now, the humans had proven that they were more than that. They were a force to be reckoned with. The question that gnawed at him was this: what was it that made them so persistent? What drove these humans to risk everything in the face of overwhelming odds? He had seen the same fire in other species before, but none had been as determined as these humans. Their actions weren't those of a race merely trying to survive. No, they were fighting for something much bigger, a place in the galaxy. "Commander," an officer called from across the room, "we've lost communication with the flagship. The human ship is already far away. What are your orders?" Vrax took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. His instincts screamed for immediate retaliation. But another part of him, something more calculating, told him to be patient. The humans had shown their strength, but Vrax knew that the fight wasn't over. They were not defeated yet. "Follow them," he ordered, his voice cold but resolute. "We'll give them no time to recover. If they want to make a stand, we'll crush them before they can make another move." Meanwhile, aboard the Intrepid, Sarah Carter felt the weight of the moment. They had managed to damage the Zorathian flagship, but the battle wasn't won yet. The crew had celebrated their success, but Sarah knew better than anyone that this was just the beginning. They had dealt a blow to the Zorathians, but now they were the ones being hunted. The ship's engines hummed as they accelerated into the vastness of space, putting as much distance as possible between them and the Zorathian fleet. But Sarah's eyes were fixed on the radar screen, where the unmistakable shapes of Zorathian warships were closing in fast. "They're coming," Lieutenant Reed said, his voice tight with tension. "They're not giving up. We've only bought ourselves a little time." "I know," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the rising pressure. "But we've shown them something. We've made them realize that we're not just another species to conquer. We're here to stay." The crew went silent as Sarah's words sank in. There was a sense of pride in the air, but also a palpable fear. They had faced down the Zorathians before, But now, it was clear that they were in for a much more dangerous confrontation. The Intrepid had no chance of outrunning the Zorathian fleet for long. They were fast, but the Zorathians had numbers on their side. Sarah knew that unless they did something drastic, they would eventually be caught. "Captain, we need a plan," Reed said, glancing nervously at the approaching Zorathian ships. Sarah's mind raced. What could they do? What could they possibly do to survive when the odds were so heavily stacked against them? "Prepare the crew for emergency protocols," she said, making a decision. "We're going to play our ace. We've got a weapon that they don't expect." The crew looked at each other, confused. "What do you mean, Captain?" Reed asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "We've been dodging their fire for a reason. We've got a way of fighting back. We're going to use the Intrepid's unique capabilities to our advantage." "Unique capabilities?" Reed echoed, still unsure. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes flashing with determination. "We have the technology to create an artificial black hole." Reed's eyes widened. "You mean?" "Exactly," Sarah interrupted. "The Zorathians are about to surround us, but they won't expect us to fight back with a weapon of this scale. We'll create a controlled singularity and use it to disable their fleet." Reed was silent for a long moment, digesting the gravity of Sarah's plan. "That's a huge risk, Captain. We're talking about creating a gravitational force strong enough to destabilize the area. If anything goes wrong, we could all be pulled in. The ship might not survive." "I know the risks," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's the only option we have. If we can disable their fleet, we can escape." Reed looked at the captain for a long time, then nodded. "I trust you, Captain. Let's do it." The crew worked together, following Sarah's orders with precision. The artificial black hole, a device they had tested only in theory before, was now their last hope. With the Zorathian ships closing in, they activated the device. The ship groaned under the strain as the singularity began to form. A small, concentrated pocket of gravity began to grow in the center of the ship, pulling in light and matter as it gained strength. The Zorathians, unaware of what was coming, continued to close in. Then, with a sudden flash of brilliance, the artificial black hole exploded outward. A massive gravitational wave rippled through space, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The Zorathian ships were caught off guard as the wave disrupted their formations, causing their ships to shake and stall. The intensity of the gravitational force caused their weapons to misfire, and the once pristine fleet was thrown into disarray. The Intrepid shook violently as the black hole's force rattled its hull, but Sarah and her crew held on. The Zorathians were reeling, their ships losing control, unable to respond to the attack. For a few precious moments, the humans had the upper hand. "We did it," Reed shouted, a mixture of relief and disbelief in his voice. "We've disabled their fleet." But Sarah's heart remained heavy. The Zorathians wouldn't be defeated so easily. The Intrepid had given them a moment of respite, but the fight wasn't over. They had thrown a punch, but now they had to see if the Zorathians would strike back. "Prepare for a counterattack," Sarah said, her voice determined. "We may have crippled them, but we're not out of danger yet." As the crew readied themselves for whatever came next, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the tides of war had truly shifted. Humanity had thrown its first punch, and now, the Zorathians would have to decide if they were willing to pay the price for their arrogance. The galaxy would never see them the same way again.